In this video, we'll talk about rests, augmentation dots, ties, and how all of these things relate to rhythm and meter. Silence is as important in music as the sound itself. Silence is expressed in musical notation with a rest. Like rhythmic values, each rest has a specific duration in number of beats. So in fact, for each of the rhythmic values we have seen previously, like the quarter note, half note, etc., there is a corresponding rest of the same duration. The names of the rests are just like of their note counterparts plus the term rest. So the first one you see here is a whole note, the one below is a whole note rest. This is a half note, and this is a half note rest, so on and so forth. Here's how each of the 5 rests look like. Notice that even though the whole note rest and the half note rest look essentially the same, a little black rectangle, the whole note rest hangs on the staff from the 4th line from bottom to top, and the half note rest sits on the 3rd line. There's a subtle but actually a very important distinction. The quarter note rest, to me, it takes a little imagination to see this, but to me it looks like a Z on top of a C, very stylized. The 8th note rest, also using my imagination here, is like an upside down and mirrored L, right? Like that. Notice how the 16th note rest is basically the same thing as the 8th note rest, but with a double flag, right? So it's replicating what you see here on the note here. So you would imagine that the next level, which is the 32nd note, the 32nd rest, would have 3 flags here, which is the case, by the way. Typically, the quarter, the 8th, and the 16th note rests are centered on the staff. That's where they're located, more or less like this. Like beaming 8th and 16th notes, there is an appropriate way of using rests according to the meter, and likewise there's an inappropriate way of doing that. Some of these rules make perfect sense according to logic, and some not as much. These have been handed down to us by tradition, but we still follow them. I think you'll see what I'm saying. The first principle is that we try and minimize the number of rests by using the longer rest possible where the situation allows. So for example, if you have an empty measure of 4/4, right, when no one is singing, no one is playing their instrument, instead of using 4 quarter note rests or 2 half note rests, we would use a whole note rest instead, like you see here. Right, so that indicates that the whole measure is silent there for that particular performer or singer. Here's the part where it doesn't make as much sense. Because 4/4 is so common and whole note rests fill that measure, it has become more or less synonymous with empty measures. So we also use whole note rests to indicate empty measures in 3/4, 2/4, and basically every other meter. Right? So if you see a whole note rest, that's what it indicates, an empty measure. So you will not play or sing anything for the duration of that measure, whatever the meter. Half note rests are used only in certain circumstances. Counterintuitively, they're not used in 2/4, right? Because if they would be worth 2 beats, 2/4 has 2 beats per measure. But since it would take the whole measure, we use whole note rests instead to indicate silent measures in 2/4. They're not used in 3/4 either, partly because of tradition and partly because they would obscure the beat hierarchy in 3/4. So half note rests, in the purview of these 3 meters here, are basically only used in 4/4 and on very specific circumstances. If it falls on beat 1, like you see in the example here, or if it had fallen on beat 3, which are the strong and semi-strong beats of 4/4, but never on beat 2, like you see here. Instead, what you would have is 2 quarter note rests. Right? So here you'd use more rests than you could, because then you make more readily clear what the beat hierarchy is. Right here, you'd be subsuming in a way beat 2, a weak beat, to beat 3, which is stronger than beat 2. Here you have another example of something that is incorrect. Quarter note rests are used only on the heads of the beats, so they can't start at a fraction of a beat like you see here. So here you have the downbeat happening with this eighth note. Then you'd have one beat, right, of rest, of silence here. But since it starts halfway through beat 1 of this 4/4 measure, you wouldn't use the quarter note rest. That is incorrect. Instead, you use 2 eighth note rests, right? It still means a silence of one beat, but since it starts halfway through the beat, you'd use the appropriate rest in that case there. So listen to this example. We're returning to that melody that we did in the previous videos, which is, a common enough melody, simple enough that we can come back to and vary it by adding rests and different rhythmic values, so on and so forth. And now, for the sake of review, there's a lot about it that you can already understand. You can understand that this is featuring a grand staff. So you have a treble clef, a bass clef, they're linked by a brace. So this is probably for a multitasking instrument with a wider range, such as the marimba or the harp or the piano, which is what I have here in front of me. You know what all of these rhythms are, right? These are quarter notes, eighth notes, you have a half note, you have some 16th notes here at the end and some here. You can already see the time signature as well. You know that this is 2/4, so this is simple duple meter, meaning that you have 2 beats per bar, and the 4 there below in the time signature means that each of those beats equals a quarter note, and that is exactly what you have here. And I've introduced this time some rests, so you have some eighth rests here, some quarter rests, etc. So let me play that for you and see if you can follow along and identify the elements we've just discussed. Quite simple, but I think it serves to illustrate what we have been discussing about. Between our 5 rhythmic units and their respective rests, a lot of music can be written, a lot of different durations can be expressed. However, sometimes music demands durations of unequal length that don't fit in any of those rhythmic units or with those rests. So the solution to this problem is to use 2 things in music, 2 devices in music to alter durations, and those are called ties and augmentations dots. Ties and dots greatly increase the possibilities for different durations. We'll talk about dots first, and then we'll talk about ties. Augmentation dots are placed to the left of a note head, like you see here, slightly higher than the note head. Here they have more or less, they're in the same plane, but for example, if you're drawing a note head on a line, then you want to see the dot slightly higher than that line. And what it does is that it multiplies the duration of whatever rhythmic unit it is attached to by 1.5, by 1.5. It sounds very complicated at first, maybe too mathematical, but it's actually rather simple. So if you take a half note, right, and typically in 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, it lasts for 2 beats. If you add the augmentation dot to the half note, it'll last 2 times 1.5, which is 3 beats. Dotted half notes fill an entire 3/4 measure and are also used in 4/4, but they can't fit in 2/4 because the measure only allows for 2 beats, so it's never seen there. So therefore, a dotted quarter note lasts 1 times 1.5, which equals 1.5 beat, and a dotted eighth note has half times 1.5, which equals 0.75 or 3/4 of a beat. A dotted quarter note is usually followed by an eighth note or 2 16th notes, so that together this cell and this cell add up to 2 beats. And likewise, a dotted eighth note is usually followed by or preceded by a 16th note. They're beamed together so that they together express one single beat. There are dotted whole notes, and if you multiply 4 by 1.5, what you have is 6, so they last for 6 beats, but they do not appear in 2/4, 3/4, or 4/4, right? But they do appear in other meters that allow for that duration, and there are such things as dotted 16th notes. They do exist, but they're not as common. They last 3/8 of a beat, or 0.375 beat, and they're usually followed by a 30-second note so that they complete half a beat. So you can see that those durations are quite fleeting, right? They can be quite fast, but obviously they are present in music and can be found in many examples. Augmentation dots can also be placed on rests to the same effect. You multiply the duration of the rest by 1.5. However, half note rests do not occur in 2/4 because it's too long. In 3/4, because empty measures are expressed with whole note rests, right? So counterintuitively, again, you would think a dotted half rest would be used in 3/4, but since it would fill the whole measure, you use a whole note rest instead, or in 4/4, right? So even though it exists in theory, dotted half rests are not used in 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. They are used in other meters, but not in these that we have discussed so far. So mostly in those meters, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4, you'll be dealing mostly with dotted quarter note rests and dotted eighth note rests. Ties. Ties combine the durations of two adjacent rhythmic units. Upon seeing them, the performer or the singer will attack the first note, right? We'll start singing or playing on that first note and then hold it for duration of both rhythmic units. So a simple way to understand how a tie works is by expressing what a dotted rhythm would be like as two tied rhythms. So if you would tie a half note, like you see here, to a quarter note, you'd play the half note and hold it all the way through the quarter note for a total of 3 beats, which is, the added duration of both rhythmic units involved. That equals a dotted half note. So because of this, this is a good example, but because it equals a dotted half note, typically, in this case and in general, we would tend to use augmentation dots whenever we can instead of ties. But in essence, that's what you can do with ties. You can use them to express a great variety of durations not encompassed in one of the 5 basic rhythmic values we've discussed, with or without augmentation dots. So even though ties must be placed in adjacent notes, you can chain many ties together in sequence. And ties can even cross over bar lines, so the possibilities are numerous. I have given you some examples here. I've tied a quarter note to a dotted eighth note to a total duration of 1 3/4 of a beat. Here I've tied 2 half notes together, so I have 6 beats in 2/4, right? So you can achieve a rhythmic duration, a rhythmic unit that is longer than the meter by tying over the bar line, just like here. And here you can have 2 1/4 beat, right? So 2.25 beats by tying a half note to a 16th note. So basically you can tie anything to anything and get a great variety of rhythmic units or rhythmic durations that way. Sometimes we can express the same duration by using both an augmentation dot or a tie, but we prefer one over the other according to the meter's beat hierarchy. So the basic principle here is that we want to show where the beats fall, where the strong beats fall, as clearly as possible. So we don't mess with the beat hierarchy, or we don't try and obscure it with dots. And, even though we default to dots when we can, if it does that, we then would go and use a tie instead. So in 4/4, dotted quarter notes may happen in beats 1 and 3, like you see in this example, which are the strong and the medium beats, but not in 2, like you see here, or 4, for obvious reasons, it would fall too short here. But so you never use in beat 2 a dotted quarter note. Instead, you'd express the duration by using a tie. So tying a quarter note to an eighth note like you see here. Likewise, in 2/4, we use a dotted quarter in beat 1, but not on the second half of beat 1 like you see here. You'd use a tie instead, right, to show where the beats fall. Here you can't see beat 2, right? As weak as it is, it's more important than the fraction of the first beat. So you use a tie, and now you can clearly see where beat 2 is. In 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4, we're free to use dotted eighth notes if they can be beamed together with a 16th note to form a single beat. But like you see here in this example, but we do not use dotted eighths if it begins on the second half of a beat, like you see here. So you have beat 1 in 3/4, right? So you have the downbeat, then you have the second half of that beat, and I want a duration that is 3/4 of a beat. So instead of using a dotted eighth note here, which would obscure beat 2, I actually use tied rhythms here. An eighth note next to a 16th note, just like that. One last thing, double and triple dots do exist. They're much less common than your single augmentation dot, but they're still seen here and there in music. And the principle is basically similar, the same. Double dot multiplies the duration by 1.75. You have an example here, right? So 1 becomes 1.75 in this measure of 2/4. Then it allows only for a 16th note to fill the 2 beats necessary. And a triple dot, even rarer, multiplies the duration by 1.875 times what it's worth. So here you have another example. Okay, thanks a lot for watching. In our next video, we'll discuss compound meter.